Our journey begins on the coast at Saint-Nazaire and the mouth of the River Loire. And along the river valley are some of the finest castles, palaces and houses in France. As we head upriver past Nantes, the main towns on our journey will be Angers, Tours, Blois and Orléans. Some of the palaces we will see are enormous and ancient, built over 400 years ago. Many of the castles date back even further in time. At Orléans, we head northeast, away from the river, to end our journey at two palaces. First, Fontainebleau, and then on to one of the architectural masterpieces of Europe, Vaux-le-Vicomte. Saint-Nazaire, on the north bank of the Loire estuary, came into prominence during the 19th century, when the harbour expanded, shipbuilding began, and the railway arrived. The harbour is perhaps most famous for the daring and successful British Commando raid during World War II, when an old ship full of explosives was rammed into the dock gates to prevent the use of the dry dock by large German battleships. The Germans used Saint-Nazaire as a base for naval operations in the Atlantic, and inside the harbour is an enormous old German U-boat pen with concrete an incredible 9 meters thick, which was capable of withstanding any Allied bomb. The robustness of its construction means that even today demolition would be uneconomical. The base is now used by cafes, a bar, and on the roof is an exhibition about the harbour. The Loire is the longest river in France at 1,012 kilometres. It's been referred to as the Garden of France and is flanked by hundreds of historic estates as well as many famous French wine regions that line the banks. Muscadet, Sancerre, Pouilly-Fumé. The city of Angers lies in the Loire Valley, 3 miles north of the river on a small tributary. The Chateaux d'Angers has a history stretching back to the Romans, who had a fort on the site. The 17 massive towers were built in the 14th century and reduced in height during the 16th century with the stone used for developing the growing town. Further damage was done to the castle during the German occupation of World War II, when a munitions dump inside the chateau exploded. But even with all that's happened to the castle over the years, it's still an impressive sight. An equally impressive sight, and the first of many on this journey, is the Chateau du Plessis-Bourret. It was built in only 5 years, from 1468, and has been altered externally very little since then. It even has the original working drawbridge. The style of conical roofs is something which can be seen in many of the houses and palaces along the Loire Valley. The river provides water for the fertile valley where farmland and vineyards are interspersed. Large parts of the landscape are also forested, with many of these forests going back to medieval days, when they were used as hunting parks, attached to the different chateaux along the valley. The Chateau du Saumur stands on the edge of a forest, overlooking the river and town of the same name. It was built in the 13th century and later became the home of the Dukes of Anjou. Over the centuries, it has been used as a military barracks and a state prison under Napoleon Bonaparte. Today, it is undergoing extensive restoration. Another castle is 10 miles to the south on a small tributary of the Loire, the Chateau de Montreuil-Bellay. The castle seen today dates from the 13th century, with a turreted curtain wall built in the 15th century. During the French Revolution, it was taken over by the new government and turned into a women's prison for suspected royalists. In 1822, it was bought by a rich local merchant who divided the castle into rental units. His daughter then took over the whole property, and her descendants continue to live in the castle today. Standing in the middle of farmland is the stronghold of the Chateau du Rivaux. The castle was once four-sided, with turret towers on each corner. As the turrets projected out from the wall, they were able to protect the entrance, with an enemy trying to get across the drawbridge. Since 1992, the castle has undergone a great deal of restoration. The design of the castle is in a classic 15th century French style, with the aim of showing off the power and wealth of the owner. By the 17th century, styles had changed, and the Chateau d'Oiron on the southern edge of the Loire Valley has been built as a house rather than a fortress, and the design has been influenced by classical ideas from ancient Rome. At the end of the 17th century, the house was lived in by Madame du Montespan. She'd been King Louis XIV's mistress and moved into the chateau after he'd tired of her. The chateau was then ransacked in the 1790s during the French Revolution and left largely abandoned until it was bought by the state in the 1930s and turned into a very successful modern art museum. On the north bank of the river Vienne, close to where it meets the Loire, is the Chateau de Chinon. This massive fortress was built in the 12th century by King Henry II of England, who was also ruler of this area of France, which at the time was the separate kingdom of Anjou. King Henry died in the castle, and he and his wife, Eleanor of Aquitaine, as well as his son Richard the Lionheart, are all buried in a nearby abbey. The castle was partially restored in the 19th century. At the confluence of the Vienne and Loire rivers is the Chateau de Montsoreau, built in 1455 as a strategic fortress controlling river traffic along the Loire. Like so many other castles in this valley, it was in near ruins by the end of the 19th century, until it was bought by the local council and eventually restored and turned into a museum. On another tributary of the Loire is the Château d'Azay-le-Rideau. It was built by a rich financier who wished to establish his new nobility. It was designed in the first stirrings of the new French Renaissance style of the early 16th century and sits in a dammed section of the River Indre. The 19th century writer Honoré de Balzac described the Château d'Azay-le-Rideau as bathing in the Indre River like a princely creature. The Château de Villandry is also built in the French Renaissance style and incorporates a 14th century tower fortress. But what marks this chateau out from the others is the spectacular formal garden. Once owned by Napoleon's brother, Joseph Bonaparte, the chateau fell into disrepair and was on the verge of being demolished before being bought by a Spanish doctor, Joaquim Cavallo, in 1906. He then poured an enormous amount of time, money and devotion into restoring the chateau and creating one of the most beautiful gardens in the world. And like many other chateaux of the Loire, it is now a World Heritage Site. The gardens are laid out in a classic formal style, with several kilometres of box hedging. There are all sorts of water features, ornamental flower gardens, and even a vegetable parterre. 10 miles up the Loire is the largest city in central France, Tours. The 12th century cathedral stands on the south bank of the river. It was the arrival of the railway in the 19th century that saw the city revive its fortunes as it began to expand into the surrounding countryside. And in that countryside are some of the hundreds of vineyards that lie along the banks of the Loire. In the Vouvray wine region is one of the oldest vineyards in the Loire Valley, here at the Château de Moncoteau. Way back in the 10th century, caves were excavated in the riverbank to mature and preserve the wine. By the 15th century, Vouvray's fame had spread across much of northern Europe, and the vineyards were cultivated in the best positions overlooking the river. The chateau itself dates back to the 15th century, though it was severely damaged by fire and nearly destroyed during the French Revolution. In fact, going back even further in time to the 4th century, the estate belonged to the Bishop of Tours. Vouvray is made from the Chenin Blanc grape, which can be enjoyed in dry wines, sweet ones, and also in a sparkling version. Due to the abundant acidity, Vouvray can age for quite some time, and also some varieties can be drunk when young. Upriver is the Royal Chateau d'Amboise, which King Charles VII seized from Louis d'Amboise in 1434, after condemning him to death for plotting against the crown. Charles then set about extensively rebuilding the chateau into a favourite of French kings during the 16th century. He also laid out the first formal Renaissance-style garden in France. Like so many other palaces along the Loire, it fell into disrepair over the centuries, and large parts were demolished. But it's still an imposing sight. As is the Pagoda de Chanteloup, the only surviving bit of the now demolished Chateau de Chanteloup. This Chinese-inspired tower is 44 metres tall and, rather like a wedding cake, has 7 tiers. Inside, a staircase allows visitors to climb to the top and look down into the semicircular reflecting pool. The pagoda was built by the Duc de Choiseul in 1775, when he was exiled to his estate for defying King Louis XV. He saw it as a temple of friendship for all the well-wishers who came to see him during his disgrace. This is the Chateau de Chateaux, and surely one of the most sublime in the Loire Valley. With the palace built across the River Cher and the arches reflected in the still water, the sheer beauty of Chateaux has made it the most visited of all the chateaux of the Loire. The main section was built in the 1520s, but was later seized by the crown for unpaid debts. It was then given to King Henry II's mistress, Diane de Poitiers, who improved the house and built a bridge across the river. After the king's death, his wife and regent, Catherine de Medici, had Diane de Poitiers expelled from Chateaux by exchanging it for the Chateau de Chaumont, which we will see later. In the 1560s, Catherine de Medici would spend a fortune on the house, and most importantly, build a gallery on top of the bridge that gives Chateaux its shape today. She also replanted the garden in a formal style. The Queen held spectacular parties, often at night, and it's said she held the first ever firework display in France. After her death in 1589, the chateau went through a series of owners, until one of them, in the early 18th century, sold off all the contents. Chateaux was saved during the Revolution because the bridge was the only one for many miles. In 1913, the Menier family, famous for their chocolates, bought the house, restored it, and still own it today. And in a final thought, Chateaux played a part during World War II, as the bridge separated Nazi-occupied France with the French Free Zone on the opposite bank, and was used by many people to escape. Continuing upstream along the Loire is the Chateau de Chaumont, which Diane de Poitiers moved to after being forced out of Chateaux. It was built on a hill overlooking the river in the early 1500s in a medieval fortress style, but decorated with some early Renaissance details. In the 18th century, the north wing of the castle was demolished to provide a better view of the river. After much neglect, the state bought Chaumont in 1938, and it's now a museum. 10 miles up the Loire is the town of Blois and its enormous royal chateau, which was a residence of several French kings. The Chateau de Blois was built between the 13th and 17th centuries, comprising several buildings around the main courtyard. The palace has 564 rooms, each with its own fireplace, 75 staircases, and 100 bedrooms. One of the best-known parts of the palace is the monumental staircase built in 1515. It's covered with decorative sculpture and dominates the central courtyard. At the end of this long avenue is the Chateau de Chevigny, which was completed in 1650 for the Hureau family. The house has been built in a rigidly symmetrical design, with a roofline which seems to break the building into 5 separate sections. During the French Revolution, the family had to give up much of their wealth and therefore were forced to sell the house in 1802. But they bought it back in 1834. In 1914, the chateau was opened to the public, one of the first great French houses to do so. Children visiting may well feel they recognize the chateau, because the Belgian comic book creator, Hergé, used Chevigny as the inspiration for Marlinspike Hall in his Adventures of Tintin books. A few miles to the north is the Chateau de Ville-Savin, built in the 1530s for Jean le Breton. The chateau was constructed by the master craftsmen who had worked at the royal palaces on the Loire. This was because Jean de Breton was Secretary of Finance to King François I, and also Superintendent of Works for the hunting lodge that the king was building in a forest 4 miles away, the Chateau de Chambord. This is perhaps one of the best known and most recognizable chateaux in the world because of its monumental scale and distinctive French Renaissance style. It's a mixture of old medieval forms with new classical ideas from Italy. The enormous roofline is a mass of intricate designs of chimneys and cupolas that almost resemble a skyline of a fantasy town. The project was so costly that it was never finished, and only the central section and north side were completed. So who designed this enormous palace? One suggestion is that Leonardo da Vinci, who had been a guest of King François at another Loire chateau, was responsible. However, there is no real evidence to prove it, and in fact to this day it's still a matter of controversy as to who really was the architect of Chambord. The king spent barely 7 weeks a year at the chateau on short hunting visits, and any visit at the time meant that all the furniture and wall coverings had to be transported, unpacked, and then packed up after the hunting trip finished. Future kings largely abandoned Chambord, and Napoleon gave it to one of his generals, who then sold it. After many owners who tried to look after it, the state took over, and it's now a very popular museum. Today, the River Loire has around 150 bridges across it, many of them historic. This is the bridge at Beaugency, which has a history stretching back to the 14th century. During its long life, the bridge has been extended, repaired, and parts rebuilt. The different shaped arches give a clue to all this work. Over the centuries, floods and ice in winter have caused much damage. War also played its part, because in 1870 one span was destroyed on the orders of the French military during the Franco-Prussian War. In the 1970s, this historic bridge, which was becoming unstable, was completely restored and shored up. Today, the River Loire is navigable for large boats for only about 30 miles. But 200 years ago, the river was an important trading route, and flat-bottomed barges could travel over 200 miles upstream to Orléans. The city is dominated by one of the largest cathedrals in France, Sainte-Croix d'Orléans, which was first built in the 13th century. and then rebuilt in the 16th century after being damaged in war. At Orléans, the River Loire bends to the south, and our journey heads northeast to a royal palace. This is the Palace of Fontainebleau, and the work of many French monarchs. It was begun back in the 16th century and is arranged around a series of courtyards. It was François I, creator of Chambord, who built the initial courtyard. Succeeding French kings then added more. But by the middle of the 17th century, Fontainebleau began a steady decline, as the Palace of Versailles took over the interest of King Louis XIV. During the French Revolution of the late 18th century, the entire contents of Fontainebleau were sold off to ensure it could not be used as a royal palace again. However, within a decade, Napoleon Bonaparte began to transform the palace into a symbol of his grandeur. And it was here, in 1814, that he bade an emotional farewell to his old guard, before going into exile on the Isle of Elba. A few miles to the north is the final destination of this journey, and one of the greatest architectural masterpieces of not only France, but of the world, the Chateau de Vaux-le-Vicomte. In 1641, a young parliamentarian called Nicolas Fouquet bought an old castle and estate at Vaux-le-Vicomte. 15 years later, he had risen to the powerful position of finance minister to King Louis XIV. And in this position, he was able to amass a small fortune, which meant he could begin construction of what was to become the finest chateau and garden in France. This spectacular achievement we see today was the result of Fouquet picking the best people to carry out his dream. The first was the architect Louis Leveau, the second was the painter and decorator Charles Lebrun, and the third was the garden designer André Lenotre. Working closely with their patron, they were to create not only a spectacular house, but also a centre and haven for leading French artists of the day, all of whom contributed to the beauty of Vaux. For the plan of the garden to work, Fouquet purchased and then demolished 3 villages. The displaced villagers were then employed in the upkeep and maintenance of the gardens. It was said that he employed 18,000 workers to create the gardens at a staggering cost in today's money of around $150 million. All this wealth and influence meant Fouquet had enemies, and they conspired to ruin him. In August of 1661, Fouquet held a spectacular garden party for the king to show off his new house and garden. It was to be his downfall, because it was not a good idea to outshine the king, who had Fouquet arrested for embezzlement and imprisoned for life. Louis then confiscated most of the furniture, tapestries and pictures, as well as all the garden statues and orange trees. He also took the 3 designers, Leveau, Lebrun and Lenotre, and put them to work on his new palace, Versailles. By 1875, Vaux-le-Vicomte was in a terrible state, but luckily for us today, it was bought by a French industrialist, Alfred Sommier, who, together with his descendants, slowly brought the great chateau back to life, so that visitors can marvel at this quite fantastic palace and garden. A perfect place to end this journey.